The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains of our modest Cleveland kitchen, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden table where I'd spent countless hours. The coffee had gone cold again, but I didn't mind. Mrs. Henderson from next door sat across from me, her weathered hands wrapped around her favorite blue mug, eyes bright with anticipation. "Tell me about the time you met Frank at the steel mill," she urged. Leaning forward like a child waiting for a bedtime story, I smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that came with sharing memories. It was 1967 and I was delivering lunch to my father when I saw this young man covered in soot, arguing with the foreman about safety protocols. "Mom? Seriously?" The voice cut through my story like a rusty blade. His expensive suit wrinkled from another long day at the marketing firm. His dark hair was disheveled and those familiar, "There's leftover meatloaf if you're hungry." Marcus grabbed a bottle of water, his movements sharp and impatient. "Mrs. Henderson, don't encourage her. She's been telling the same stories for 20 years. Marcus." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "What? It's true." He took a long drink, then looked at both of us with that patronizing expression that made my heart ache. "Mom, no one wants to hear about great-grandpa's farm. I think your mother's stories are wonderful, Marcus. She has such a gift for what? Making normal stuff sound dramatic?" Marcus shook his head, already heading toward the stairs. "I've got real work to do," each footstep echoing my growing sense of defeat. Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Don't let him get to you, Eleanor. He's just stressed about work." I nodded, but the words felt hollow. This wasn't new behavior. Marcus had been dismissing my stories for years, ever since he'd graduated college with his literature degree and started working at that fancy firm downtown. "Maybe he's right," I whispered, staring at the rings my coffee mug had left on the table. "Maybe I am just an old woman rambling about the past." Mrs. Henderson's voice was firm. "That boy doesn't know what he's missing. The way you tell stories, you make people feel like they're right there with you. When you talked about dancing with Frank at the church social, I could practically hear the music." I smiled despite myself. Frank had been gone for 3 years now, but when I told stories about him, he felt alive again. He was such a terrible dancer. Stepped on my toes every single time. "But you married him anyway." "He made me laugh," I said simply, "and he listened to my stories. Really listened." After Mrs. Henderson left, I sat alone in the kitchen as evening shadows crept across the floor. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I walked to the living room and opened the old cedar chest where I kept my notebooks, dozens of them. When Marcus was just 3 years old, the pages were yellowed with age, but my handwriting was still clear. I'd written about the day he'd fallen off his tricycle and scraped his knee, how he'd cried not from pain but from embarrassment because the neighborhood kids had seen him fall. "You're going to be a proud one," I'd written, "just like your father." How prophetic those words had been. I flipped through more pages, reading about school plays and little league games, first dates and graduation ceremonies, every milestone, every moment of joy and heartbreak carefully preserved in my own words. These weren't just stories to me, they were proof that our family had lived, had loved, had mattered. The front door slammed upstairs. Marcus was going out again, probably to that trendy bar downtown where he met his fellow creatives. I used to wait up for him, hoping he'd stop by the kitchen for a late-night chat like he used to. But those days were long gone. I closed the notebook and hugged it to my chest. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was wrong. Maybe I was just a sentimental old woman clinging to memories that no one else cared about. But these stories were all I had left of Frank, of my parents, of the life we'd built together in this house. The next morning, I found Marcus in the kitchen, gulping down coffee and scrolling through his phone. His face looked haggard, stress etched in every line. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He grunted without looking up. "Peterson's breathing down my neck about the Henderson account. Says my campaign ideas are predictable and lacking authentic voice." I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "Maybe you could, Mom, please." "I don't need advice right now," but I pressed on, unable to help myself. "You know, when your father was struggling with his sales numbers at the car lot, he started listening to customers' stories, really listening. He said it helped him understand what they actually needed." Marcus finally looked up, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and annoyance. "Dad sold cars. Mom, I work in creative marketing. It's completely different." "Is it though? Aren't you both trying to connect with people, to make them feel something?" "Jesus, Mom." He stood up, grabbing his briefcase. "Everything doesn't have to be a life lesson wrapped in one of your stories. Sometimes a job is just a job." He left without saying goodbye, leaving me alone with the echo of his words. I stared at his empty coffee mug, still warm from his hands, and felt the familiar ache of loving someone who didn't want to be loved, at least not the way I knew how to love. That afternoon, I called my sister Dorothy in Phoenix. "He's just going through a rough patch," Dorothy said, her voice crackling through the phone. "Remember when he was 16 and told you he hated you because you wouldn't let him go to that party? This feels different. He's not a teenager anymore. He's a grown man who's ashamed of his own mother. Nonsense. He's just forgotten where he came from. Success can do that to people." "What success? He's miserable at that job." "Then maybe he needs to remember what really matters." "Keep telling." But as I hung up the phone, I wondered if Dorothy was right. Maybe it was time to stop forcing my memories on someone who clearly didn't want them. Maybe it was time to let the past stay buried. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and one of my oldest notebooks. I opened to a story I'd written about the day Marcus was born, how Frank had paced the hospital corridor for 14 hours, wearing a groove in the linoleum floor, how he'd cried when the doctor placed Marcus in his arms, whispering, "He's perfect, Ellie, just perfect." I touched the page gently, remembering how Marcus used to love that story, how he'd make me tell it every year on his birthday, always asking for more details about how proud his daddy had been. When had he stopped asking? When had my stories become burdens instead of gifts? The house creaked around me, full of memories and empty of the laughter that had once filled these rooms. He was home, but he might as well have been on the moon. The distance between us felt insurmountable, built from years of misunderstanding and hardened by pride his and mine. I turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs to my own room, passing the closed door of my son's childhood bedroom. Now, I was just an old woman with too many stories and no one left to tell them to. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, while I was sorting through Frank's old clothes for the church donation drive. The words hung in the air between us. I sank onto Frank's side of the bed, still holding one of his flannel shirts. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. What happened?" Peterson said I wasn't connecting with the target demographic, that my work lacked emotional authenticity. His voice cracked. 5 years, Mom. 5 years of 60-hour weeks, and they just threw me away. My heart broke for, "We'll figure this out together." "I can't. I signed a lease on this apartment and the rent is." He stopped, and I could hear him crying. "We'll talk about everything else later." There was a long pause. Okay, Mom. I'll be there around 8. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet bedroom, surrounded by Frank's things. If he were here, he'd know exactly what to say to Marcus. Frank had always been the one who could reach our son when I couldn't. I spent the afternoon cooking Marcus's favorite pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans the way he liked them. It was a gesture of love, the only way I knew how to show him that he was welcome here, that this would always be his home. When Marcus arrived, he looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was messy, his designer clothes wrinkled, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and tears. He dropped his suitcase by the door and stood awkwardly in the hallway. "Hi, Mom. Hi, sweetheart." I wanted to hug him, but something in his posture warned me away. "Are you hungry? I made pot roast." "I'm not really." He stopped, sniffed the air, and his expression softened slightly. Yeah, that sounds good." We ate in relative silence, the clink of silverware against plates, the only sound in the kitchen. Marcus picked at his food, lost in thought. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked gently. He looked up, and for a moment I saw the little boy, who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys. "I thought I was good at my job, Mom. I really did." "What kind of risks?" "Authentic storytelling, emotional connection, all the things that make people actually care about a brand instead of just buying a product." He pushed his mashed potatoes around his plate. "I used to have ideas, you know. In college, I wrote stories that made people cry. Real stories about real people." "What happened to those stories?" Marcus shrugged. "Life happened. Bills happened. I learned that weird personal stuff doesn't sell soap and car insurance." I wanted to tell him about the stories I'd written, about the notebooks full of authentic life experiences sitting in my cedar chest, but I bit my tongue. This wasn't the time for one of my rambles. "Maybe you could try freelancing," I suggested. "Write the stories you want to write? With what money? I've got rent, car payments, student loans." He ran his hands through his hair. "I'm 38 years old, Mom. I can't just start over." 28, I corrected gently. "What? You're 28? Not 38? He looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "Right, 28. See, I can't even keep track of how old I am anymore." That night, I lay awake listening to Marcus pace in his old bedroom above me. I remembered all the nights I'd listened to him walk the floor as a baby, how Frank and I would take turns trying to soothe him back to sleep. "He's thinking too hard," Frank used to say. Just like his mama. The next morning, I found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, surrounded by crumpled papers and empty coffee mugs. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. "Any luck?" I asked, pouring myself coffee. 17 applications, 3 rejection emails, and 14 radio silences. He rubbed his eyes. I'm beginning to think I imagined having any talent at all. I sat down across from him, studying his face. He looked so much like Frank, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of pursing his lips when he was thinking hard. But there was something else there too, something I recognized from my own reflection in the mirror. Marcus, can I ask you something? Sure. When you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up? He looked up from his laptop, surprised by the question. A storyteller, like ... Like you, actually. The admission seemed to embarrass him. I wanted to write books that made people feel the way your stories made me feel. My heart skipped. What changed? Reality changed. You can't pay rent with bedtime stories, Mom, but you can pay rent with good stories. Look at all the successful authors out there. Those are different kinds of stories, he interrupted. Fantasy, sci-fi thrillers, stuff that sells. Not just ... memories, just memories. I felt a familiar sting. Marcus, every great story starts with a memory, with someone's truth. He closed his laptop with a snap. Mom, please. I'm trying to find a real job here. I don't need a lecture about the power of storytelling. I stood up, frustration boiling over. You know what? You're right. I'm just a silly old woman with silly old stories. What could I possibly know about connecting with people? I didn't say you didn't need to say it. You've been saying it for years with every eye roll, every dismissive comment. Every time you act like my experiences are worthless, Marcus stared at me, shock written across his face. I'd never spoken to him like this before. Mom, I know. Let me finish. You sit there complaining about lacking authentic voice, about not being able to connect emotionally with people, but you've spent years dismissing the most authentic voices in your life, your father's stories, my stories, the stories of everyone in this neighborhood who's lived and loved and lost. I was crying now, years of hurt pouring out. You want to know what authentic storytelling looks like? It looks like Mrs. Henderson talking about her husband's battle with Alzheimer's. It looks like your father's stories about growing up poor and working 3 jobs to buy me an engagement ring. It looks like the stories I've been trying to share with you for years, the ones you think are so boring and irrelevant. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. I'm going to the grocery store. When I get back, maybe we can figure out how to talk to each other again. Or maybe we can just keep pretending that my life, our family's life, doesn't matter. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, leaving Marcus sitting at the kitchen table looking like I'd slapped him. Maybe I had in a way. I pulled into the parking lot and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles were white. I'd never spoken to Marcus like that before. Of being sweet, tired of being dismissed, tired of watching my son struggle with problems that my stories might actually help him solve, if only he'd listen. When I got home an hour later, Marcus was gone. His laptop was still on the kitchen table, but he was nowhere to be found. I checked. His room, his suitcase was still there, so he hadn't left permanently. But where was he? I found him in the basement, sitting on Frank's old workbench, holding one of my notebooks. The cedar chest was open beside him, and several other journals were scattered around. Marcus, what are you? I was looking for a phone charger. He said without looking up. I found these instead. He held up the notebook he'd been reading. It was one of my oldest ones from when he was just a baby. I'm sorry I went through your things, he continued. But I started reading this story about the night I was born, and He looked up at me and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I remember you telling me this story, but reading it, ... it's different. It's like I'm actually there. I sat down on Frank's old chair, facing him. Those are private, Marcus. I know, and I'm sorry, but Mom, ... this is incredible. The way you describe Dad pacing the hospital corridor, the way you capture his exact words when he first held me, ... He flipped through the pages. This isn't just a memory, this is literature. I felt heat rise to my cheeks. It's everything I've been trying to achieve in my work. Authentic voice, emotional connection, stories that make people feel something real. He stood up, holding the notebook like it was made of gold. Mom, you're a writer, a real writer. I'm just a mother who likes to remember things. You're a mother who documents the human experience with the kind of honesty and beauty that most professional writers would kill for. He walked over to the cedar chest and looked at all the notebooks inside. How many of these are there? 47, I said quietly. I've been keeping them since I was 25. 47 notebooks. Full of stories like this. I nodded. Marcus sat back down, shaking his head in amazement. I've been such an idiot, such a complete idiot. Marcus, no, Mom, I have. I've been sitting in boardrooms trying to create authentic content, and I've been living with the most authentic storyteller I've ever encountered. I've been complaining about not being able to connect with people, while dismissing the woman who's been teaching me about human connection my entire life. He opened the notebook again, reading aloud. Frank held Marcus for the first time at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November. The baby was purple and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Frank looked at me with tears streaming down his face and said, "Ellie, family would be stronger than anything the world could throw at us." Marcus's voice broke on the last sentence. "That's the kind of story that changes people, Mom. That's the kind of authentic voice that makes people remember what really matters." I wiped away my own tears. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." "Enjoyed it, Mom. I'm in awe of it. This is what I've been searching for my entire career." This is what Peterson was talking about when he said I lacked emotional authenticity. He closed the notebook and looked at me seriously. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Okay, have you ever thought about publishing these stories? Turning them into a book?" I laughed, but it came out bitter. Who would want to read the ramblings of an old woman from Cleveland? "Everyone," Marcus said with absolute certainty. "Everyone who's ever loved someone. Everyone who's ever lost someone. Everyone who's ever wondered if their life matters. These aren't ramblings, Mom. They're proof that ordinary life is extraordinary." I stared at him, seeing something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Respect. Real, genuine respect. "You really think so?" "I know so, and I want to help you. If you'll let me." For the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope. My son was finally listening to my stories. Not just listening, he was hearing them. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus smiled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to beg for just one more story at bedtime. "How about we start with finding you a real audience? One that deserves to hear what you have to say." The next few weeks passed in a blur of excitement and possibility. Marcus threw himself into helping me with the same intensity he'd once applied to his corporate job, but this time his eyes were bright, with genuine passion instead of desperate ambition. "We need to organize these chronologically first," he said, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor surrounded by open notebooks. "Then we can group them thematically: love stories, family stories, stories about loss and recovery." I watched him work, marveling at how different he seemed. Gone was the stressed, bitter young man who dismissed my stories as rambling. In his place was someone who handled each notebook like it contained precious gems. "This one about you and Dad's first fight," he said, holding up a journal from 1972. "The way you describe how he brought you daisies from the neighbor's garden because he couldn't afford real flowers. Mom, this is the kind of story that makes people believe in love again." "It was just a silly argument about him leaving dishes in the sink," I said, embarrassed by his enthusiasm. "No, it wasn't. It was about two people learning how to apologize, how to forgive, how to choose love over being right. That's universal, Mom. That's what makes great storytelling." Marcus had set up a makeshift office in the living room, complete with his laptop, a printer, and stacks of my notebooks organized by year. He'd also started a social media account for me, though I wasn't entirely sure what that meant. "People need to know about your work," he explained, showing me the screen. "Look, you already have 50 followers, and I only posted one story yesterday." "Which story? The one about Dad teaching me to ride a bike? Remember, you wrote about how he ran behind me for 3 hours, never letting go, even though I kept yelling that I could do it myself." I remembered that day vividly. Frank had been so patient, so encouraging, even when Marcus had scraped his knee and declared that bikes were stupid. It had taken every ounce of Frank's self-control not to laugh when Marcus had immediately asked to try again. "People are commenting." Marcus continued, scrolling through responses. "Listen to this one. This made me cry thinking about my own father. Thank you for reminding me that love is in the details, and this one I'm calling my dad. Tonight, I haven't talked to him in months." I stared at the screen, amazed. Strangers are reading my stories. Not just reading them, connecting with them, sharing them. This is what I meant about authentic voice, Mom. Your stories make people remember what matters. The doorbell rang, interrupting our work session. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch holding a casserole dish and beaming. "Eleanor, I had to come over. My granddaughter saw your story online and called me crying. She said it reminded her of her grandfather, my late husband. She's driving up from Cincinnati this weekend just to spend time with me." I looked at Marcus, who was grinning like he'd won the lottery. "People are sharing your stories with their families," he explained. "They're using them as conversation starters, as ways to connect with their own memories." Mrs. Henderson nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what happened. Sarah, my granddaughter, she read your story and started asking me about her grandfather. We talked for 2 hours about things I thought she'd forgotten." After Mrs. Henderson left, Marcus and I sat in the kitchen, both of us quiet with the weight of what was happening. "I never thought my stories could do that," I said finally. Do what? Bring people together. Make them feel less alone. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. Mom, that's what your stories have always done. I was just too stubborn. To see it, you were scared, I said, surprising myself with the insight. Scared of being vulnerable, of admitting that you needed something from me? He squeezed my hand. Yeah, I was. Success felt safer than authenticity, but authenticity is what actually connects people. That evening, Marcus made an announcement that shocked me. I want to quit looking for corporate jobs, he said over dinner. I want to focus on this full-time on helping you share your stories with the world. Marcus, you need income. You have responsibilities. I have savings, enough to last a few months. And if we do this right, if we really commit to it, I think we can turn this into something sustainable. What do you mean? A book, Mom? A real book, and maybe more than one. You have enough material for a whole series. His eyes were bright with excitement. We could call it Letters from the Kitchen Table or Stories My Mother Told Me. Something that captures the intimacy of how you share. These memories, I felt a flutter of excitement, mixed with terror, but I don't know anything about publishing. I do. I've been researching it all week. There are literary agents who specialize in memoirs and family stories. There are publishers who are looking for exactly this kind of authentic voice. And if they say no, then we self-publish. But Mom, I don't think they'll say no. Your stories are too good, too real. They're exactly what people are hungry for right now. The next morning, Marcus presented me with a printed manuscript, 50 pages of my stories, carefully edited and formatted. I want you to read this, he said. Really read it, like you're encountering these stories for the first time. Then tell me if you think people would want to read them. I spent the afternoon reading my own words, seeing them through Marcus's eyes. He'd chosen stories that spanned my entire life, from childhood memories of my grandmother's garden to recent reflections on losing Frank. He'd arranged them in a way that created a narrative arc, showing how love and loss and resilience wove through a lifetime. Reading them all together, I began to understand what Marcus saw. These weren't just random memories. They were a testament to the power of paying attention, of finding meaning in ordinary moments, of choosing to see beauty even in the midst of pain. Well, Marcus asked when I finished. There paused, searching for the right words. They're better than I remembered. They're exactly as good as they always were. You just needed to see them the way other people do. That night, I called Dorothy in Phoenix. Ellie, this is incredible, she said. After Marcus had emailed her the manuscript, I'm reading the story about Mama's last Christmas, and I can practically smell her apple pie. You've captured her so perfectly, the way she hummed while she baked, the way she always made sure everyone had seconds. You think people would actually want to read this? Are you kidding? I've been crying and laughing and remembering things I thought I'd forgotten. This isn't just a book, Ellie. It's a love letter to family, to memory, to the importance of paying attention to our lives. After I hung up, I found Marcus in the living room, typing on his laptop. What are you working on? A query letter? He said to literary agents. I want to get this manuscript in front of the right people. I sat down beside him, watching him work. His fingers flew across the keyboard, crafting sentences that made my simple stories sound like literature. Marcus, yeah, I'm proud of you. He stopped typing and looked at me. I'm proud of you too, Mom. You've been creating art your whole life without even realizing it. I meant I'm proud of the man you've become. The way you've thrown yourself into this project, the way you've supported me. Your father would be so happy to see you like this. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. I wish he were here to see this, to see you getting the recognition you deserve. He is here, I said, touching his hand. Every time you read one of my stories about him, every time you share his memory with someone else, he's here. Is that what this is about for you? Keeping his memory alive? I thought about it for a moment. Partly, but it's also about proving that ordinary lives matter. That the love between two people, the struggles of raising a child, the small moments of joy and sorrow, that all of it is worth preserving. Marcus nodded, understanding. That's what makes your stories so powerful. You don't just remember events, you remember what they meant. 3 weeks later, we got our first response from a literary agent. Dear Ms. Santos, Marcus read aloud from his laptop. Thank you for your query. Your manuscript samples show remarkable emotional depth and authenticity. I would be interested in seeing the full manuscript. I sat down heavily in my chair. She wants to see more? She wants to see everything, Mom. This is it. This is our chance. I looked around the living room at the notebooks and papers scattered everywhere, at the evidence of our weeks of work together. A month ago, I'd been a lonely widow whose son thought her stories were worthless. Now, I was a writer with a manuscript and an interested agent. I'm scared, I admitted. Of what? Of hoping too much, of being disappointed. Marcus came over and knelt beside my chair. Mom, no matter what happens with this agent, or with publishing, or with any of it too are already a success. You've spent your whole life creating something beautiful and meaningful. You've preserved our family's history, captured the essence of what it means to love and be loved. But what if she doesn't like the full manuscript? Then we'll find someone who does. Because your stories deserve to be read, Mom, by lots of people. By people who need to be reminded that their own lives matter, that their own stories are worth telling. I reached up and touched his face, seeing Frank's eyes looking back at me. When did you become so wise? I had a good teacher, he said, smiling. She just had to hit me over the head with a few life lessons before I started paying attention. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and one of my oldest notebooks. I was writing a new story about a mother and son who found their way back to each other through the power of shared stories, about how sometimes the most precious gifts are the ones we've been carrying all along. Waiting for the right moment to unwrap them, the story was still unfolding. But I had a feeling it was going to have a happy ending. 6 months later, I stood in the Barnes & Noble in downtown Cleveland, staring at a display table filled with books bearing my name. Kitchen Table Wisdom, a mother's stories had been on the shelves for 3 weeks, and according to Marcus, it was selling better than anyone had expected. Mrs. Santos. I'm Jennifer from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. We spoke on the phone about the interview. I turned to face a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. She reminded me of myself at that age. Hopeful, ready to find meaning in the world around her. Of course. Thank you for coming. As we settled into chairs near the cafe, I caught sight of Marcus across the store, signing books at a table set up near the front entrance. He looked confident, professional, every inch the successful author. But something about the scene made me uneasy. So tell me about your journey to publication, Jennifer said, pulling out her recorder. It's such an inspiring story, a grandmother discovering her voice later in life. I started to answer, but the words caught in my throat as I watched Marcus interact with readers. He was telling them about the stories, about the process of bringing them to light, about the universal themes of love and loss that resonated with everyone. Mrs. Santos, I'm sorry, what was the question? About your journey? How did you realize you were a writer? I looked back at Marcus, who was now signing a book for a young mother holding a baby. He was smiling, engaged, completely in his element. Actually, I said, turning back to Jennifer, I need to tell you something important, something that's been weighing on me. Jennifer leaned forward, intrigued. The book cover says as told to Marcus Santos, but that's not exactly accurate. Marcus didn't just help me organize my stories, he rewrote them. Extensively. Jennifer's eyebrows rose. What do you mean? I mean the words on the page aren't entirely mine anymore. They're a collaboration. Marcus took my memories, my experiences, and he made them more literary, more publishable. I could see the confusion in Jennifer's eyes. But they're still your stories, right? Your experiences? Yes. But it's like someone took my grandmother's recipe and made it fancier, more appealing to modern tastes. It's still her recipe, but it's not her voice anymore. Jennifer nodded slowly. And how do you feel about that? Before I could answer, Marcus appeared at our table, his face flushed with excitement. Mom, you should see the line. There are at least 30 people waiting to meet you. He noticed Jennifer and extended his hand. You must be from the Plain Dealer. I'm Marcus Santos, Eleanor's son and co-author. Jennifer's pen paused over her notepad. Marcus glanced at me, and I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise. Maybe even alarm. Well, I helped organize the stories, edited them for publication, but they're all Mom's experiences. Her voice, actually, I said quietly. We were just discussing that. I was explaining to Jennifer how much you contributed to the final manuscript. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus sat down slowly, his excitement deflating like a punctured balloon. Mom, what are you doing? I'm telling the truth, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Something I should have insisted on from the beginning. Maybe I should come back another time. No, I said firmly. Please stay. This is important. I turned to Marcus, whose face had gone pale. Honey, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. When you rewrote my stories, when you polished them and restructured them and added literary flourishes, did you ever think about asking my permission? Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Because I've been reading reviews online, I continued, and they're all praising the beautiful prose, the sophisticated narrative structure, the way the author me supposedly weaves themes together with such skill. But Marcus, those aren't my skills. They're yours. Mom, I was trying to help you. I was trying to make your stories the best they could be. I know, and I appreciate that. But somewhere along the way, they stopped being my stories and became your interpretation of my stories. Jennifer cleared her throat. Mr. Santos, are you saying you significantly rewrote your mother's original work? Marcus looked trapped. I enhanced them, made them more accessible to readers. Enhanced, I repeated, tasting the word. Is that what we're calling it? The hurt in Marcus's eyes was unmistakable. Mom, everything I did was to honor your memories, to share your wisdom. With the world, I never meant to what? Take credit for my voice. Because that's what happened, isn't it? The publishers, the reviewers, even our neighbors, they all think I wrote those polished literary stories. But the truth is, I wrote simple, honest memories in a notebook, and you turned them into literature. Marcus stood up abruptly. I think I need some air. He walked away, leaving Jennifer and me alone with the weight of what had just been revealed. This is quite a story, Jennifer said carefully. It is, and it's one that needs to be told correctly. I looked toward the front of the store, where people were still waiting in line, holding copies of a book that bore my name but contained Marcus's words, I love my son, and I'm grateful for what he's done, but I can't continue to accept praise for work that isn't entirely mine. That evening, Marcus and I sat in our kitchen, the same kitchen where this whole journey had begun. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken hurt and disappointment. I never meant to steal your voice, Marcus said finally. I know, but you did, and what's worse, I let you. What do you mean? I mean, I was so flattered by your attention. So grateful that you were finally listening to my stories that I didn't question what you were doing to them. I sighed, feeling older than my 72 years. I wanted your approval so badly that I gave up my authenticity. Marcus put his head in his hands. So what happens now? Do we tell the publisher? Do we stop the book tour? I don't know. But I know I can't keep doing interviews where people praise me for your writing. It's not my writing, Marcus said desperately. It's your life, your experiences, your wisdom. I just made it prettier. But pretty isn't always authentic. Marcus, inauthenticity, was supposed to be the whole point. We sat in silence for a while, both of us grappling with the mess we'd created. Finally, Marcus spoke. What if we came clean? What if we told everyone the truth about our collaboration? You mean admit that the great Eleanor Santos isn't really a gifted writer after all? That's not. Marcus stopped, seeing the pain in my eyes. Mom, you are a gifted writer. Your original notebooks are proof of that. I got carried away trying to make them perfect for publication. Why? The question came out sharper than I'd intended. Why wasn't my voice good enough as it was? Marcus was quiet for a long moment because I was afraid they'd reject it. Reject you? I couldn't bear the thought of publishers dismissing your stories the way I had dismissed them. The admission hung between us like a confession. So you fixed them? I tried to make them undeniable. I tried to make them so beautiful, so polished, that no one could possibly reject them. But in doing that, you rejected the original voice that made them special in the first place. Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was trying to protect you, but I ended up stealing from you instead. I reached across the table and took his hand. I know, sweetheart, and I forgive you. But we have to figure out how to make this right. The next day, I called our editor at the publishing house. Eleanor, how wonderful to hear from you. The book is performing beautifully. We're already talking about a follow-up. That's actually what I'm calling about, I said, my heart pounding. I need to discuss something important about the attribution. The conversation that followed was difficult, awkward, and necessary. I explained the extent of Marcus's contributions, the way he'd restructured and rewritten my original stories. I watched our editor's enthusiasm dim as she realized the implications. So you're saying the book isn't entirely your work? It's my life, my experiences, my memories. But the actual words on the page are largely Marcus's interpretation of those memories. There was a long pause. This is complicated. We've marketed this as your debut memoir. The authenticity of your voice has been a major selling point. I understand, and I take full responsibility for not being clear about this from the beginning. We'll need to discuss this with our legal team and with marketing. This could require significant changes to how we position the book going forward. After I hung up, I found Marcus in the basement, sitting among my old notebooks again. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. How did it go? About like you'd expect. They're not happy. Marcus closed the notebook he'd been reading. I've been thinking, what if we donated all the proceeds to charity? What if we made it clear that this was never about money or fame? That's generous, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which is that we built something beautiful on a foundation of dishonesty, even if it was unintentional. Space. So what do? How do we fix this? I looked at the notebooks, scattered around dozens of them, filled with my actual voice, my real stories. We start over. We do it right this time. What do you mean? I mean, we publish a new book? One that clearly identifies you as Kothor? That explains our process. That gives readers both versions, my original stories and your enhanced versions. We let them decide which voice they prefer. Marcus stopped pacing. You'd be willing to do that, to show people your original writing alongside mine? I'm not afraid of comparison anymore, Marcus. My voice may not be as polished as yours, but it's honest, and I think readers deserve honesty, even if it means admitting we made mistakes with the first book, especially then. Authenticity isn't just about being real in the good times. It's about being real when you've messed up, too. Marcus sat back down, looking at me with something like, no, I'm just tired of pretending to be someone I'm not, even if that someone is more successful. That night, we started planning our redemption. We would write a new book together, real collaboration this time, with both our names on the cover and clear delineation of who contributed what. We would include some of my original notebook entries alongside Marcus's polished versions, letting readers see the evolution of the stories. Most importantly, we would be honest about our mistakes, about how a son's love for his mother and a mother's hunger for recognition had led us down a path of unintended deception. What should we call it? Marcus asked as we worked at the kitchen table late into the night. I thought about everything we'd been through, about the lessons we'd learned about authenticity and collaboration and the price of borrowed glory. About finding our voices, a mother and son's journey through stories and truth. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in days. I like it. It's honest. It's a start, I said, opening one of my oldest notebooks. Now, let me tell you a story about a mother who thought her voice wasn't good enough, and a son who tried so hard to make her perfect that he almost made her disappear. Marcus picked up his pen, ready to write. But this time he was writing our story, not just mine, not just his, but ours. And for the first time since this whole journey began, that felt exactly right. As I began to speak, sharing the real story of our collaboration and its consequences, I realized something profound. The most authentic story we could tell wasn't about the past at all. It was about the present moment, about two people learning to be honest with each other and with the world. It was about finding the courage to be imperfect, and discovering that imperfection might be the most beautiful truth of all. The kitchen table held us both as I began. Once upon a time, there was a mother who had stories to tell, and a son who thought he knew how to tell them better. And this time, every word that followed would be true.